Hello, everyone. I'm Christina Chu. This is Let's Talk Books. We have a really wonderful evening tonight. The topic is really limits in the body, and we're going to talk about these authors' works and how it fits in with that theme, and then we'll go wherever the conversation takes us. So, thank you for joining us. We have um, three authors: Rachel Verona Cote, or Cote. Is that Cote?
Yeah.
Douglas Stewart and Claire Beans. Do you guys have your books with you so you can show your book covers? Yes. So see that cover in your mind. Yes. Okay, good. Thank you. Yes. So these are authors who, like me, were launching during COVID, and it's been really difficult trying to get out there. So please, I'm so glad you're joining us tonight. You're going to hear them read. You're going to hear them discuss their work, and then support these authors, please. So each of our authors will read a couple pages, and then we will talk about, we'll start the discussion. But we'll start our reading with Rachel. Rachel Verona Cote is the author of Too Much: How Victorian Constraints Still Bind Women Today, which is published in February 2020 by Grand Central Publishing. She also publishes frequently in places like the New Republic, Hazlitt, Literary Hub, Pitchfork, and Catapult. She was previously a contributing writer at Jezebel. She lives in Tacoma Park, Maryland. Everyone, please welcome Rachel. Rachel, before you read, will you please talk a little bit about your book and explain to the audience why it's so important that they get your book?
Oh gosh. Well, I don't know that, but I can tell you a little bit about it. I'm a nonfiction writer, and this is my first book. It was born from a lot of academic enthusiasms in my previous life. I studied Victorian literature and culture, and so the general thesis of the book is or thesis premise is a study of the ways that excess is pathologized and gendered. And so I'm using this term "too much" or the sort of noun form that I've come up with, too muchness. And what that gestures to when I'm talking about is this sort of fundamental feminine excess that tends to that tends to be sort of scouted out in women identified persons. So whether that means pathologizing someone's emotional perceived excess, or one's sexuality, one's embodiment, as I know we'll talk about tonight, mental illness. It's a very general sort of baggy term, and it's meant to be, because I think that when we put pathologizing excess and lampooning women as being too much, it's supposed to be ambiguous. It's that that's how it hits the hardest. So I guess I'll just read a couple of the first pages, if that works. So this is from the first chapter, introduction, Wonderland. A weeping woman is a monster. So too is a baffled, woman, a woman shrieking with laughter. Women who are one or more of these things have heard, or perhaps simply intuited, that we are repugnantly excessive, that we have taken illicit liberties to feel, fuck, or eat with abandon. After bellowing like a barn animal in orgasm, hoovering a plate of mashed potatoes, or spraying out spit in the heat of expostulation, we flinched in self-scorn. Ugh, that was so gross. I am so gross. On rare occasions, we might reel in our excess, belting out anthems with our friends over karaoke perhaps. But in the company of less sympathetic souls, our uncertainty always returns. A woman who meets the world with intensity is a woman who endures flashes of shame and disapproval from within as well as without. In Victorian England, the medical establishment would have labeled us hysterical, pathologically immoderate in emotional and physiological expression. Here's how a German-born doctor practicing in London, one Julius Eppes, defined the condition in 1866. All the symptoms of hysteria have their prototype in those vital actions by which grief, terror, disappointment, and other painful emotions and affections are manifested under ordinary circumstances and which become signs of hysteria as soon as they attain a certain degree of intensity. Of course, a certain degree of intensity invites a vast range of interpretation, and when it came to emotional eruptions, the Victorians were none too generous. Hysteria was a convenient means of pathologizing and thus regulating feminine feeling and its expression. Today, as many among us grieve our political optimism and hammer out our anger on social media, we find our husbands, our boyfriends, our parents, our politicians diagnosing us with similar maladies. We're wallowing in it. Why are we so freaked out? We must be bleeding out of our wherever. Take a Xanax, girl, and calm down. We are the women who can hardly contain our screams, and oftentimes we don't. Our muchness oozes from our pores like acidic sweat, ranker, more caustic, less concealable than ever. But however brutally the stigma may sizzle in this political moment, this sense that we are somehow too much is hardly new to us, nor will it dissipate whenever Donald Trump's vise finally unclenches from our skulls. I conceived the idea for this book, a critical cry of bullshit against this concept, too much, some years ago during a comparatively happier presidency. This term, too much, pernicious in its ambiguity, attacks with the force of history. It's the overdetermined exponent of ideologies centuries old, structured by misogyny, racism, and homophobia. American society fetishizes white heteronormative propriety. It wants its girls pliable and demure, girls who safeguard both tears and sex for the privacy of the bedroom, who keep their voices measured during meetings, and who brush their hair and blot their lipstick. It worships the women who, if she should experience distress, will wear her sadness like Lana Del Rey or Middlemarch's Dorothea Brooke, with genteel sensuality and relative quiet. Anything more, well, that would be excessive. Accordingly, "You're just too much" is the threat of patriarchy disguised as a playful admonition. It is a warning, even a diagnosis. It is saying, this space is not yours to colonize. This power is not yours to claim. Systemic oppression relies on the careful partitioning of social space. Specifically, it requires that marginalized peoples, of which women are one broad example and women of color and queer persons are more pointedly targeted ones, dwell within corners, that we shrink inside walls that loom and compress. The public devises unspoken rules of deportment born from anxieties over what we can bear to see expressed, and accordingly, whom we are willing to allow the privilege of expression. Reluctant to countenance emotional and physical extremes in any case, women, long regarded as the lodestars of excess, are eyed like shapeshifters with the power to transform into Medusa. But I've since realized that there is power in what others call monstrosity. Our refusal to abide, to prioritize the comfort of the West's hegemonic governance, lays bare the rickety scaffolding of culture's so-called behavioral norms. The roots of rules are never so deep that they cannot be wrenched from the soil. Man-made boundaries remain at the mercy of the creatures who erected them. For when we are too much, and when we refuse to apologize for that, we burst against those walls and marvel as they give way like sand. I'll stop there.
Wow, thank you. Wasn't expecting that. That was great. Thank you. Our next reader is Douglas Stewart. He's a Scottish-American writer. Where are you right now, Douglas?
I'm in New York.
You're in New York. Oh, you're in the city?
I am. You can't
Yes.
tell by the sweat dripping off of me.
Well, I'm in the city too, so I get it. So Douglas Stewart, he's a Scottish-American writer whose fiction has appeared in The New Yorker. His debut novel, Shuggie Bain?
Shuggie, a hard U, a flat U.
Oh, wow. It's a heartbreaking tale of addiction and a son's love for his troubled mother. That's beautiful. Can you read a couple pages, but first just describe a little bit about, if you don't start from the beginning, describe where you're
Absolutely. Thanks for having me, Christina. Like you said, Shuggie is my debut novel, and it is essentially the portrait of the Bain family, who are a proud working-class family living in 1980s Glasgow, Scotland. Glasgow went through a really tough time, like most sort of industrial cities. In the 80s, it was deindustrializing, and Thatcher, with her remote policies, actually took unemployment in the city to about 25%, and it stayed there for a generation. And so amongst this sort of set against this backdrop, we're looking at the Bain family. The mother of the family is Agnes Bain, who is a very proud, a little bit vain woman who models herself on sort of a Glaswegian Elizabeth Taylor. She has ink black hair and is incredibly proud of her brand new white porcelain dentures. But Agnes has married the wrong man. She's married across sectarian lines, and as a very staunch Catholic, she's married a Protestant taxi driver who is called Big Shug. And Shug is the Scottish sort of nickname for anyone called Hugh. So she's married Big Shug. And Shug actually, philandering's too nice of a word. He's essentially passing himself through all of her friends and across the city, and he's using his taxi to do that. So as Shug continues his philandering, Agnes begins to descend into alcoholism and addiction. And when her husband abandons her in the most terrible way, she really sort of spirals into this addiction. We then really sort of focus on her three children, and the youngest of her children, young Shuggie, is really sort of Agnes's his son, who soon becomes a black hole within his life, and he does everything he can to save his mother. So it's really a portrait of looking at these two outsiders in a working man's world. What I'm going to read to you now is when we first meet our heroine, Agnes. She is still thick with love and thick with friends, and we see her at a card party with a lot of her friends, or a card school, on a Friday night in Glasgow in the Sighthill Tower blocks, which are actually now being demolished. They would be what Americans would call, they're a housing scheme. I know them as a housing scheme, and you guys would call them a housing project. Agnes Bain pushed her toes into the carpet and leaned out as far as she could into the night air. The damp wind kissed her flushed neck and pushed down inside her dress. It felt like a stranger's hand, a sign of living, a reminder of life. With a flick, she watched her cigarette doubt fall, the glowing embers dancing 16 floors down on the dark forecourt below. She wanted to show the city this claret velvet dress. She wanted to feel a little envy from strangers, to dance with men who held her proud and close. Mostly, she wanted to take a good drink, to live a little. With a stretch of her calves, she leaned her hip bone on the window frame and let go of the ballast of her toes. Her body tipped down towards the lights and her cheeks flushed with blood. She reached out to the lights, and for a brief moment she was flying. But no one noticed the flying woman. She thought about tilting further then, dared herself to do it. How easy it would be to kid herself that she was flying until it became only falling, and she broke herself on the concrete below. The high-rise flat she still shared with her mother and father pressed in against her. Everything in the room behind her felt so small, so low-ceilinged and stifling. Payday to mass day. It was a life bought on tick, with nothing that ever felt owned outright. To be 39 and have her husband and her three children all crammed together in her mammy's flat gave her a feeling of failure. Him, her man, who when he shared her bed now seemed to lie on the very edge, made her feel angry with the littered promises of better things. Agnes wanted to put her foot through it all, or to scrape it back like it was spoilt wallpaper, to get her nail under it and rip it all away. With a bored slouch, Agnes fell back into the stuffy room and felt the safety of her mammy's carpet below her feet again. The other women hadn't looked up. Peevishly, she scraped the needle across the record player. She clawed at her hairline and turned the volume up too loud. Come on, please, just the one wee dance. No yet, spat Nan Flanagan. She was feverish and arranging silver and copper coins into neat piles. I'm about to pimp out the lot of you. Rainy Sweeney rolled her eyes and held her cards close. Oh, you have one filthy mind. Well, don't say I didn't warn you. Nan bit the end off a slab of fried fish and sucked the grease from her lips. When I'm done taking all your menage money at these cards, you're going to have to go home and fuck that bag of soup bones you call a husband for more. No chance. Reenie made a lazy sign of the cross. I've been sitting on it since Lent, and I've no intention of letting him get at it until next Christmas. She pushed a fat golden chip into her mouth. I once held off so long I got a new colour telly in the bedroom. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Douglas. That was wonderful. So our final speaker tonight is Claire Beams. She's the author of the new novel, The Illness Lesson, a New York Times Editor's Choice. Yay! And the story collection, We Show What We Have Learned, which was the winner of the Bard Fiction Prize and finalist for the Young Lions Fiction Award and the PEN Bingham Prize. She lives in Pittsburgh with her husband and her 2 daughters. So everyone, this is Claire.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much, Christina, for doing this. And it's such a pleasure to be here reading with these wonderful writers. So my novel is The Illness Lesson. I keep getting confused with the directions of the camera. It's different from a mirror. So I'm not going to read from the beginning, so I'll tell you just a little bit about it to start. So the novel is set in 1871 Massachusetts, where an aging philosopher who's kind of outlived his fame is deciding to try for greatness one more time by starting a school for girls, in which he's going to sort of show the world that girls can do all the same things that boys can do. And our main character, Caroline, is his 29-year-old daughter, who's sort of been his first project in this respect, in that she's had the kind of education that he is now peddling. And she is very reluctantly teaching at the school because she has sort of been trapped by the kind of education that her father has provided, in that he's founded his school and he's founded really his life on all of these very beautiful principles about kind of the equal value of all souls, including women's souls, which at the time was a very unusual idea, perhaps maybe still is an unusual idea some of the time. But he has sort of also founded that education on the idea that he is always the paramount authority, that if there's ever a conflict between sort of his daughter's judgment and his own, everyone, including his daughter, should trust him. And so I think the book is really about the traps of sort of providing this beautiful education that sort of leaves no space for the femaleness of the students and for the fact that their lives are not going to really be the same as if they were men, and sort of what that does to them. And what that does to them is it sort of creates, the students arrive, and there's one sort of very problematic student named Eliza who starts having these mysterious symptoms. And the passage that I'm going to read from is where the other girls also begin to experience these symptoms, and so too does Caroline. And then the other thing that you should know is that there's a creepy flock of red birds around called Trilling Hearts. Okay, so this chapter is called Spread. I'm just going to read the first couple pages of it. After Meg, it happened quickly. Rebecca collapsed in the garden. When she came in to report this, there was a streak of dirt across her cheek. Felicity lowered her collar to show her red-pocked neck. Julia shifted her skirts to show a rope burn of red circling her ankles. Abigail's sentences began to tumble into hmms as if she were questioning or had not heard herself. Tabitha buckled at the knee with each step, though she kept taking them, saying, "I can't make them hold." Last was Livia, whose fingers began twitching. They spidered beside her plate at breakfast. "I can't control it," she said, looking down. They all said, "I can't control it. I'm not doing it. I don't know how to make it stop." "It isn't an illness, whatever it is," said Samuel. "We can feel even surer of that than before. So many maladies, there can't be one physical cause." Though he was not overly familiar with physical causes. He went into Ashwell and sent Hawkins a telegram this time. "He'll be here in a matter of days." He fixed his eyes on Caroline's. "Days, Caroline. We can still send them home." She pictured, even as she said this, a string of coaches bearing a string of limp, white-faced girls back to their families like a funeral procession. "We will, if it comes to that," Samuel said. He made this coming to sound like some state clearly distinct from the one they were in. Caroline didn't see the telegram itself. She wondered how he'd worded it. She went to find Eliza because she feared talking to Eliza, and she wanted the feeling of doing something she was afraid of. Eliza was spread on the parlor sofa in a violet dress, reclined and reading. Romeo and Juliet, Caroline saw, and she felt as if she might cry, but that wasn't the right sort of feeling. She sat at the end of the sofa by Eliza's feet. Eliza lowered her book across her chest. She left her hand pressed to its covers as if she were shocked, though her face was calm enough. Miss Bell, I don't quite know what to say. Eliza waited. Tell me, do you have any insight into all this? I'm wondering if you can help us. Tell us what you think of it, how it seems to you. Eliza, so still, looked to Caroline like part of the sofa. The thick purple fabric of her dress so heavy, the thick dark of her hair and lips, as if the pale girl inside all that had been brocaded into place. Really, I don't know, Eliza said. Hidden between her back and the sofa cushion, Caroline's thumb touched each fingertip of her left hand. Today it was the left, trying to pinpoint where the numbness started from. Well, what are your thoughts? You must see that you can't all have caught a twitching, rash fainting fit illness. Eliza ruffled her book's pages. She was back in Act 2. I've been too busy feeling it to be able to think about it much, she said. What does it feel like? Does it feel like what I feel? You haven't been indulging the feeling, have you? Encouraging the others to indulge it? Eliza's gaze sharpened. You think we're making it up? How could we even? I just wanted to be certain you weren't taking it in some romantic way, all of you thinking yourselves doomed heroines, imagining the birds might land all over you. Caroline smiled a little here to show she knew she was being absurd, and couldn't Eliza see when she herself was absurd too, and carry you off somewhere? Eliza shifted back on her elbows, and her body in motion was a surprise that she wasn't sewn still after all. What would you know about going anywhere, she said. And I'll stop there.
Wow, that was beautiful. Thank you. Wow. So we have this theme, limits in the body, and really we have this theme because it was just the most efficient way to get different clusters of authors together to talk about their work. So just take it with a grain of salt when we talk about these issues, because not everyone is going to be talking about, the limit of a woman's body, or, so just keep that in mind. So I'm just going to start by asking Claire. So, what when you were reading that, I was thinking about the Salem witch trials.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I couldn't help but think about that, because remember, like, those girls start to act really bizarre, and then everyone assumes they're just witches.
Right.
So like, did you realize that was a pattern that were you deliberately trying to touch on that or remind us of that?
Well, so it's actually, what's fascinating when you start, I didn't know anything about mass hysteria when I started writing this book, but this is a pattern that has happened kind of with some frequency through history, including in like 2012 in Rye, New York. There was a group of schoolgirls who just started having all these inexplicable symptoms, and they were sort of strangely contagious, but really difficult to pin on a certain physical cause. And the Salem witch trials are another example. They're sort of these patterns. It's often young women who sort of catch this in a group. And so I didn't know that the girls in my book were going to have mass hysteria. I just sort of knew that when I started writing, I was thinking about this contradiction of the sort of beautiful promise and the lived reality of the school. And so I knew that the girls would get there and cause trouble, and I knew that the trouble should come from their bodies. And then once I started writing, these sort of strange symptoms started sort of developing in the book. And that's at that point I started researching mass hysteria and kind of learning a little bit more about this. That's not what we call it anymore. It's usually conversion disorder or psychogenic illness. So group psychogenic illness. So these are, but I find that a fascinating idea that sort of, I think the mind, that the mind can make the physical body experience things, that the mind is really part of the physical body.
Yeah, I sort of see like this, Maya Angelou talked about the caged bird, right? So like the woman is in the cage, right? She doesn't realize she's in a cage, of course. She feels like, she has all the freedoms in the world, but really there's a cage, right? And then when she's butting up against the walls,
Right.
then she's acting bizarre and people wondering why.
Exactly. Yeah, right.
Right. So yes, I find that really interesting. I mean, Rachel, you pretty much talk about this. Your book is really so much about how women are treated, like, you know, it's just, whatever, oh, well, you're overreacting, right? Like, it's too much, just too much, just, take it easy. It's too much. Like, I'll never forget when I was giving birth, my first one, it turned out many years later, we found out I had this amyloid in my colon, right? At the time we didn't know. So during the birth, it's already painful, right? But imagine having sandpaper in your gut. And I was screaming, and the nurse, they actually blew a vein, and the nurse said to me, honey, you got to relax. Like that. I was seething for about 6 months, just seething. I was so angry. So Rachel, do you have anything you want to add?
Well, I mean, I think, so the thing is, actually, Claire and I chatted about this, was it a month ago? I no longer have any sense of time.
Neither. Yeah.
I'm like permanently jet lagged.
Right.
But I think something that that I think that we both get it, but I think that this, I think I'm thinking about it in specifically with regard to women identified bodies, as is Claire. But I think generally speaking, there is this sort of tacit, or not so tacit, just explicit sort of notion that the most reliable narrators are always white, straight, cisgender men, and that these are the people who know how, that we can trust their authority, and so by extension, we can trust what they have to say about living in a body. So when we're talking about about the hysteria diagnoses and this is something that we see too, today, as Christina, as you mentioned from your own harrowing experiences, it's very often the case that women are kind of regarded as unreliable narrators and stuff. There's this notion that we're making this up. Yeah, just as as Eliza asks, sort of accuses / asks Caroline, do you think that we're making this up? This is something that is pretty it's enduring. I don't think it started in the 19th century by any means. I think it became sort of codified in an interesting way with people being diagnosed as hysterics, and most of the people diagnosed were women. And then I think, even though as Claire said, we're not calling it hysteria anymore, but it's still very much there's still a very sort of a rhetoric of hysteria that I think endures, and that's what we see when in delivery rooms and
the ER.
Pardon me.
And the ER.
Yeah.
People going to OBGYNs and saying that they think they might have endometriosis. So it's so we in many specifically embodied ways. I think that it's something that is it's a woman's embodied experience is kind of rendered suspect, and it's always, and regardless, it's suspect. It's always suspect, and it's always in excess of what it should be.
Right. I mean, I think what's interesting about Douglas's story is that we have a protagonist who's a woman, and the limit that she butts up against, like she ends up being, depressed and suffering from alcoholism. And I found that was really so true. Like when I look around, and I used to live in the suburbs, and the suburbs look really beautiful and very bucolic, and but wow, like it was dark.
Yeah. It's true. I mean, it's actually just amazing to hear Rachel talk about being too much, because I think that's the main character's. It's not that she's too much; it's that everything else is not enough in her life, and so she has a life of actually very reasonable, quite small wants. Living in poverty and trying to raise her family in these hard situations. She wants things that are very reasonable. She wants to clothe them without having to do it on a layaway plan. She wants a front door of her own. She wants a husband who's faithful. She wants to have a little bit of fun, a party. She wants to have a drink. She wants very reasonable things. But really, what happens to Agnes in the book is she's judged very harshly for that, because it is seen as a notion of getting above her station. And it's a scene. Her husband certainly finds it exhausting, because she almost seems like she can never be pleased. But she can actually be pleased. It's just he's going about it in all other different ways to bring the relationship to absolute ruin, by sort of working his way through her friends. But really, it's just about the confines of her life. And then further on in the book, not to spoil it, but her husband, when he decides to leave her, takes her and gives her the front door of her own and abandons them essentially in a small coal mining town that has been shut down by the Thatcher government. And so she arrives in this coal mining town exactly when the men are being put out of work. And so the sort of disintegration of this woman is set against the disintegration of the city as a whole. But when she's within the coal mining town, because it's quite a small insular place, the judgment that starts to be levied against her, because although she's sort of succumbing to her addiction and starting to come apart in that way, she presents herself immaculately. She is one of, very much based on my own mother. I'm the queer son of a single mother. And, when things were especially bad or especially tough, you never went over the front door without a full face of makeup and having your hair done. Even if you were hungry, you would put your shoes on and you would put your coat on, and you just presented a very different face to the world. And when the character of Agnes arrives in the colliery town, it's actually the women who cannot abide that in her, because they see the vanity of it, they see the very thin veneer of pride, and they know that beyond that is a woman who is not living in that way, is sort of like crumbling and decaying. And of course, the misogyny is pushed down through the church in those layers until it reaches these very sort of tight-knit Catholic community. And then the women, unfortunately, use that as a weapon against Agnes. And so it was never that Agnes was too much, it was that everything else just wasn't enough.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, what's interesting is that that women do play into that, right? Like misogyny exists, but then we sometimes forget that women play a role in that. Like women voted for Trump.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, how does that happen? And I guess the question always in my mind is why do women do things that don't serve them, right? I mean, why do people do that? And I mean, there we go. We have a new novel in the works here. I actually find that really interesting when you talk about the other woman around. I mean, I felt it more when I was in the suburbs, because I have a kid with ADHD, and so what's that saying? Your kid is like the apple from the tree, or whatever that saying is. And of course, he was just rotten. I mean, he would just do and I'd be like, I just wouldn't know what to do, and people would look at me like, aren't like, you're his mother, shouldn't you be doing something? And I would be like frazzled by the time I got home every single day. And it was like I actually had moms tell me that I was not a good mom. And it was such a hard time for me that when I look back now, I'm like, I should have told that, that where she could have taken that. But at the time, I actually, since I only had one kid and I had no idea, I actually believed it.
Yeah.
But yeah, but now I have a second one, and I'm like, oh my God, what a cinch. It's like,
Great.
you're like, then you can compare. You're like, oh my God.
I think there's nothing like having two to show you that you have so little to do with it. Like they just kind of arrive a certain way. I mean, I think you can mess them up, but they do. They have a personality. Like they arrive with one. Yeah.
So yeah. So okay. So first of all, you guys have been working on these books for a while. So can you tell me, how did your story or your work germinate? Rachel, you've been doing research like this for a while, right? So this was a natural result of the research you've done?
I mean, I think yes and no. So I was in grad school. I'm sort of a erstwhile future academic. I was working on a dissertation in Victorian fiction, and then sort of while I was working on that dissertation, began writing for non-academic outlets, just as for what I thought was a pressure valve at the time. And then I, as it often happens, I found myself in the midst of a sort of creative and career based crisis, and and ended up making the very, very difficult decision to leave graduate school and focus on the work that I was doing outside of it full time. But that said, I didn't want to. I mean, everything that I had been enthusiastic about in graduate school, that I've been really preoccupied with, and in a lot of ways, I mean, questions of embodiment were really sort of central to my interests. Specifically, like the feeling of reading, like physiological responses to like reading and writing, which I now know in a different way because I now know the physiology of writing a book.
Yeah, it's interesting, right?
Yes, it is. But but I think like the sort of prevailing interests, I held them close and I kept working on them and sort of obsessing over them, but in a different way, in a way that enabled me to be a little bit more, I don't want to say take more risks. I think that there's a lot of beautiful academic writing, but but
before you go on, can you just briefly describe the difference between academic writing and what you're doing now?
Oh, sure. I mean, academic writing is, it's very specific. There are a lot of conventions, that there's a lot of literature review there, and it's often, I would say some of the best academic writing doesn't do this, but it can be very jargony. The language can be very,
or it tends to be.
Right, yeah, and it can be very technical. So if you haven't been reading a lot of Foucault or Deleuze in graduate seminar, then if you didn't have the opportunity to go to graduate school, because graduate school is very cost prohibitive, even if you do get funding, then there's a lot that there tends to be a lot that even embedded in the rhetoric that can be a little gatekeep.
Okay, so let's just for a moment come back to the germination of your novel. Douglas, can you tell us your process and how it started?
Sure. A little bit, I guess, a bit of backstory to understand where I am. Having grown up in Glasgow, education, it just wasn't seen as writing was something that a working class boy didn't do. And so by the time I left high school, my education was already sort of so broken because of the poverty within the community, and then also the addiction within my family home, that I was sort of funneled into textiles, which is a great Scottish thing to do, because what does Scotland manufacture if not whiskey and cloth? And so textiles is really what brought me to New York. That sort of perlayed into a career in fashion. But about 10 years, actually, probably about 14 years ago now, I just knew that I wanted to, that I couldn't stop writing. I just couldn't stop writing. And so I was just writing every moment I had. I was getting up early in the morning. From my husband's perspective, I was ruining every vacation with my selfishness. And so I just sat down and I wrote, and I didn't even imagine it ever being a book. I never imagined it being published. I was proving so much to myself at the time, Christina, before I could prove it to anybody else. And so I was testing my own worthiness. And I think when you grow up like that, you're always just feeling inadequate. You're always just feeling not worthy. And so about 10 years it took me to write, and they were pleasurable years. I just really enjoyed sort of working on it. And part of it also comes from my experience as an immigrant as well, because I think this man now that lives in New York and works in fashion feels so different to this kid that grew up in Glasgow in this time. And so in a way, I was kind of like connecting the two halves of myself. By doing this project, I was stitching myself back together in a little way. And the characters in the book and the city in the book, although the book is often dark or bleak or hard, it's a love story. I mean, I don't think you write about characters or a city for 10 years and not love it. Even if you're critical of it, even if you're quite harsh about it, it's still certainly a love story. And so that was really it. And, incredibly fortunate that, by the end of it, I had this 900-page manuscript, all single-spaced, just this monster of a book. And then sort of through editing it, it is the book that you see before you. But that was really it.
Thank you. How about you, Claire?
Well, so I was the kind of kid growing up who had not very many friends, and so I spent a lot of time reading. And so I think that I always, in theory, I think I loved reading so much that like eventually that love was going to become an active thing. Like I was just going to want to try to do it myself, create one of these things that I loved so much. And I think that, so I think I knew I wanted to be a writer from the time I was pretty young, like before I really knew that it was a thing a person could do. But I think that it took me a long time, like until well after I went to grad school, to understand what kind of a writer I was at all. Like, I think I wanted to do it because I had loved reading. But it took me, until some years after I got my MFA to understand what kind of writing I was really doing. So I have a whole dead novel in a drawer that was my grad school thesis and that I worked on for 8 years. And while I was doing that, I was also writing as my like fun sort of, I think you used the word pressure valve or something, Rachel, my pressure release, were these sort of really weird short stories that were just getting stranger and stranger and were so much more fun to write than that like serious sort of careful novel. And those stories actually became my first book, which was published in 2016. And kind of sort of once I figured out that the big dead novel was dead, I started this novel, which I tried, which felt from its beginning sort of more like the kind of book that I had figured out was the kind of book that I write, which is a weird, dark book. So
I love weird and dark.
Well, I do too, as it turns out, but my first efforts were just not that. I think because I just hadn't read that much that sort of gave me, I think what I had loved reading as a kid was pretty weird and dark, but then I kind of moved into like what I thought of as like serious literature and then tried to sort of write seriously and carefully and produced a lot of really boring, very lifeless stuff. So, yeah.
One of the things that I think is so interesting about what you said is that you people who aren't writers often think that the writer sits down, types out a book, and then that book becomes, what you see in Barnes and Nobles or whatever, right? And no one ever realizes that most of us, or a lot of us, have that book in the drawer, that first book or the first two books or whatever. And it takes a while to actually learn the craft and figure out what you're doing, right? Like 900 pages later.
Right. Yeah, I think I didn't understand even what I was trying to do. But so anyway, so I came back. I had loved Little Women as a kid, and I was living in Massachusetts and teaching high school English. And I went to see Fruitlands, which is the site of this failed commune that Bronson Alcott, Louisa May Alcott's father, tried to establish. And he was a really crazy guy in lots of ways. He was amazing. He was a visionary, but he was also like, he almost killed his family by trying to make them fruitarians in the middle of the winter at this like sort of middle of nowhere place in Massachusetts. And I think that contradiction was interesting to me. I think there are a lot, I still love teaching, but I think there are a lot of contradictions in teaching that I wanted to write about. And I was also pregnant with my first child. And so sort of thinking about, just what it means to shape people and, what a weird idea that even is. And so yeah, and then I sort of, wrote and rewrote and messed up for 7 years, and then I have a book.
So how much of you, I mean, I know, Douglas, with your book, you have a narrator who reminds you of your mother, you said. And so I'm, there's the temptation to assume, oh, well, he was that boy, right? Like, and he's writing, this is sort of not based on his life, but like, the relationship, the love that you felt or whatever. I mean, people go there, right? Like, so are people right about that? Is that sort of on key or totally off?
Yeah, I think it's fair to say that so much of, I think most writers are often inspired by their own life. And so certainly I grew up as a queer son in poverty, of the queer son of a single mother who lost her battle with addiction. And so that sort of covers the arc of what these characters go through in the book. But it is a work of fiction, and part of the power, I think, of the book, or the charm of it, is it's quite a panoramic view of the city. It's almost quite sprawling, and in that way, because there's a really rich theme of sort of addiction or alcoholism, or, you think of Irvine Welsh, you think of James Kelman, you think of these amazing, huge, monolithic Scottish books about addiction. But for me, I'd always seen addiction, first of all, I hadn't ever really seen it told from a female point of view in Scotland in that way. And then when it was told, it was always a very sort of lonely single room telling of addiction, where the woman sort of, was crumbling away by herself. And I'd always seen addiction actually as a super garrulous thing, as a very sort of gregarious thing, because growing up within that sort of community, there's an awful lot of networks. There are people who are also suffering. There are sponsors within AA. When a city really goes through such huge unemployment, and I mean, when we talk about sort of shipbuilding closing, coal mines, every sort of industry you can imagine closing within very close in time with each other, there was nowhere for the men to turn. And so really the addiction was in lots of households. There was women and men, but because obviously I was raised by a single mother, I had more of a connection with women, I think. But there was women disintegrating all throughout our housing scheme. And that sort of became the network. And so with the book, it's a work of fiction, but I really wanted to show that, which is why it's not a memoir, I guess, is what I'm saying in the long way around, because I wanted to show the many sort of faceted points of view around that.
Wonderful. How about you, Rachel? Yours is nonfiction, but is there like some part of you in there?
Oh, I think so. Yeah. I mean, also apologies if you hear wailing. That is my cat. She's grown so frustrated by, it was bad enough that we were always focused on these boxes of light, and now we're yelling at them all the time, and she's yeah, the book, there is a little bit of memoir too, and I think some of that just comes from the fact that this is a topic that is very personal to me. I have a lot of skin in the game in making and sort of making this argument that not necessarily that excess is good or bad, that it is, and that there's this there's these very particular ways that we talk about it and weaponize this rhetoric of excess. That's something that is very personal to me, as a very emotional and sort of maximalist person. But even when I'm not, even outside of those anecdotes, absolutely, it's I think it's hard. I don't know that you can really make an argument or commit to any sort of intellectual work where that is, that's not very much inside of your heart. Like I think that it's so even if I'm close reading a passage from Dickens, that's still it's an exercise that I really that I get a lot of pleasure from. It's very interesting to me, but it's also it's I obviously if I'm coming to conclusions, I'm coming to them because I am this person occupying this particular space and that is thinking about things in a particular way. So yeah, I think no matter what, it's
so we're definitely in there.
A pool of me, yeah,
in every way. How about you, Claire?
I never think I'm writing about my life. I'm the kind of writer that like makes up a bizarre species of bird that like behaves in ways that are not exactly realistic in this book. Like I tend towards I tend slightly towards surrealism as a writer. That being said, I think it's all me. I mean, it's all my invention, which is all me. I mean, I think in fiction, it's all parts of yourself, right? I mean, that's all you really have to work with. And so I'm never consciously aware of like taking a particular person I've known and like putting them directly into the book, really. But I think that happens all the time. Like little shades of things that I've seen or thought about. And I think at the point where you're sort of inhabiting a character, you are kind of, it's you as that character in a certain way, even if it doesn't feel that way.
Yeah, I mean, I tend to describe it to people like, my life is rather boring, so if I wrote about my real life, like it's actually not that interesting. But if I take some of those Flannery O'Connor-ish moments in my life, and add some of that to my work, oftentimes I end up with a story that's like weird, or memorable, or sometimes it's it transcends what happens in real life, right? Like, so it's like really wonderful that way. So if there was a scene or a moment in your book that you'd want to convey to the audience, that because they're only getting this brief 1 hour with all three of you guys, that kind of speaks to what the book is about or what you want them to remember or think about, what would that scene or moment be? Rachel?
Oh God. No, I'm not sure. I think
you can think about it if you'd like.
Well, I'll go with this. The chapter that I wrote first, and that was the most difficult to write, and that I think is very much at the heart of the book, is a chapter in the latter half called Cheat, and it is it takes as its focus sort of the idea of female fallenness, particularly female sexual fallenness, and the ways that we still sort of invoke this trope of the fallen woman. And woven into that is the story of me meeting my husband, which involved my own sexual fall per society. And my cat is off to the side being like, how about the scene where you feed me and pay attention?
How about that scene?
But anyway, that I think that is, I don't know if it's emblematic of the rest of the book, but I think it in a lot of ways structured a lot of the way that I approach the topic.
Okay. How about you, Douglas?
I don't know if it necessarily is emblematic of the book, but there is a scene in the book, probably about halfway through, where Shuggy, who is the youngest son of the family, is queer, and he is entertaining his mother one evening by sort of dancing in front of the television, and as she sort of smokes cigarettes, and as she's sort of watching him from the settee, and at some point she's essentially asking him to dance for her so she can learn dance moves to be relevant when she, now with her newfound sobriety, goes out and starts dating again. And at some point in his dancing, he realizes that the curtains are open and that the neighborhood beyond him is seeing him throw himself around the living room. And as a young queer boy in this sort of coal mining town, it's not a great thing. But she has realized this long before he has. And when he sort of becomes very sort of rigid with fear, Agnes says, just keep dancing, just keep going. Like, it doesn't matter, they've seen it, and the thing you do now is you carry on with pride. And really that's a sort of motif throughout the whole book, because even when she is sort of disintegrating, you see her sort of get up and dig herself out of her grave every morning and try and present that sort of facade to the world.
Wow. Mm-hmm. Wow. How about you, Claire?
So I think what I would say, when I sort of encapsulate what this book is, what my sort of line for it has always been that it's a book that's really about the long-standing tradition of sort of doubting women's bodies and minds, and all the sort of strangeness and kind of awfulness that can flourish in the space that's opened by that doubt, especially when it's an internal space. When the girls themselves are sort of taught to doubt in that way. But to me, I think that the moment that feels sort of central to the book is we watch over the course of the book, Caroline, the main character, sort of unlearn that doubt. And it's a slow process, and it's not a perfect process, and it doesn't happen when you want it to as a reader, and it doesn't really happen in time to save the girls from the things that happen to them in the book. Some of which are kind of dark and awful, but she does get there, and I think that there's a scene where she sort of takes judgment back from her father. That's sort of near the end of the book, and that does, like, when I got to that scene, I realized that I had been sort of writing toward it, and that the book that it sort of was important for that to be where the book arrived in some ways.
Wow, taking back judgment. That's incredible. That's incredible. Wait, I need that scene. So, I mean, literally, I just find it such a pleasure speaking with you, you all, about this. And because there are writers who are watching, and there are also writers who are going to watch this later, as a YouTube or whatever. Is there some advice? I mean, here we are during COVID. Is there some kernel of advice that you could give to other writers out there who are probably feeling pretty discouraged right now? What would you say to them? Claire?
So I think that the things that have helped me the most, so I think, yes, this is a discouraging moment to be trying to write, but writing is often kind of discouraging. And that's not the takeaway. The takeaway is that you kind of just have to keep doing it, and you have to be very patient. And I mean that not so much with the publishing process, I mean it with the writing itself, that you have to really learn. It takes a really long time to figure out how to write anything that's worth sort of putting out there into the world. And then you have to do it again the next time you try to start writing something you're going to put out into the world. You sort of think you'll like figure it out and it will be easier next time. And I don't think that's how it works. And so I think just finding ways to be patient and to find joy in the actual process of the writing and the learning, even when it's not going well, like sort of taking pleasure in the making of the thing better.
And what's a moment like for you that you take pleasure in?
I really don't love first draft writing very much. I find it like sort of, it can feel sort of exhausting to work up the momentum to do that, to sort of like make something out of nothing. But I love playing with something once it's on the page. I love revising. And by revising, I really actually mean writing 99% of the words that are going to end up in the final book. But I can kind of trick myself into thinking I'm just fixing it when in fact I'm like scrawling all over it and actually like putting the actual words down. But so I think like figuring out a way to make some aspect of it joyous, I think is important, because it really, best case scenario is that you get to sit down in the quiet room and do it again, right? Like, so you have to love that part, because that part is kind of it's all you can control, but it's also kind of all there is. The rest of it, even had we all gotten to go on like book tours that we had planned, like those still end. You still have to go home and like be in the quiet room again. So if you're doing it for like the public facing part of it, I think you're often going to feel disappointed.
How about you, Douglas?
I would agree 100% with what Claire said. Claire said it beautifully. I think what I would add to the sort of the call for patience is, make sure you are writing exactly what you want to write. There is so much influence in the world. There's so much noise every single day and things that beg you to pay attention to it. But at the end of the day, all that will be left in a relationship is actually you with your work. And when the book enters the world, whether it enters during a pandemic or not, you don't really have any control over so much of it. But what you will always have and will always be around your neck as a life sort of raft or a millstone. And so just make sure that when you take that patience, you're also doing it exactly for you.
Yeah.
And that actually sounds like such an obvious thing to say, but I catch myself in it sometimes, right? I think people would like that more. Yeah, but what would you like? Because you'll have the longest relationship with your book of anyone on the planet.
Exactly. Yeah.
That's great. How about you, Rachel?
I guess two things. What Claire and Douglas have said already are I think gorgeous, and I endorse 100%. I think I would only add two things. One, that your worst days, the days that you feel the most discouraged, a day that you end up with a rejection, that these, all of the ugly feelings, those are not a referendum on you as a writer. They don't, that isn't somehow that isn't like a whisper of truth, or like, oh, you're feeling bad because actually you shouldn't be doing this, or you're feeling discouraged, or this has happened because in fact this isn't because you're doing something wrong. No, not necessarily. These are very, they're very common feelings, and so part of it, yes, is absolutely to find the joy, as Claire said and as Douglas said, to be always writing what you want, because the ebb and flow is part of it. And then the other thing I would say, again, and this is obvious, I'm sure, but just read as much as you write, at least. I know that reading has made me a better writer. I wouldn't be a writer if I weren't a reader first. And don't just limit it to the sort of writing that you do. I have already devoured Claire's novel, and I've got Douglas and Christina's on the way. I want to read. I read widely, and I think that it's nourishing for me emotionally and also intellectually. So yeah, just be voracious.
Yeah, I will add to that. Buy these authors' books, please. And also, you know, there are a lot of people out there who are like, oh God, I like don't have time to read. I've got some, but the thing is since we're in COVID and we really shouldn't be out like meandering about anyway. Well, you know, what better than to read? And what I've found, and maybe you will find this too, that the more you read, and the faster you read. So it's sort of like when you don't have the muscles to ride a bike for a mile, you feel tired at the end of it, right? But if you keep doing it, after about a week, you feel like that's a cinch, right? And because the muscles are there, and your brain is a muscle. So what better than to get that thing going and make it really strong so that, you know, go out there kicking. So can we please see these? Claire, your book, please.
Well, anytime.
I have a thing about threes. You know, when you see things the third time, that's when you want to get it. You want to get it. Okay. Rachel, your book, please. Thank you. Douglas?
I have to say, those are beautiful covers as well. I love it.
I was admiring all
Wonderful.
our covers are quite striking.
So authors, please stay. Everyone else, thank you so much for joining me. I will see you next week. We'll be winding down the series towards the end of the month already. So thank you for joining us and see you next week.